Okay, hello and welcome to this latest installment in the SLSA YouTube video series. My name is Kay Lalor and I'm delighted to be joined today by Dr. Silvana Tapia Tapia, who is a research fellow at Birmingham Law School. Silvana undertakes groundbreaking research on domestic violence, carceral violence, and human rights. She currently holds a Leverhulme Early Career Fellowship exploring non-penal human rights responses to violence against women using a feminist and decolonial perspective. We're here today to discuss Silvana's monograph with Routledge, Feminism, Violence Against Women and Law Reform, Decolonial Lessons from Ecuador, which was awarded the Hart SLSA Book Prize in 2023. Silvana, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for your time and for being willing to have this conversation. It's lovely.
Thank you for being here. I wanted to start, I enjoyed reading your book so much and I learned so much, and I thought maybe we could start. Could I ask you to just give us an overview of the key themes and the key ideas of the book?
Yes, so I suppose you could speak about the book in terms of history. I guess it's one of the main lines that structure the book, has to do with how feminists, women's movements, and in general, lawmakers, policymakers, thinkers who were interested in law and violence against women have engaged with the idea of law reform, in particular criminal law reform, in Ecuador, but also more broadly in Latin America, since early Republican times, basically. I also do speak a little bit about late colonial times in Ecuador and Latin America. And obviously, there were not necessarily people self-identifying as feminists in colonial or early Republican times. You start seeing this in the 20th century. And that's when the book sort of takes on this more empirical approach, where I have managed to actually talk to many of the protagonists of these histories and ask them, how did you encounter law? What was your perspective on law reform? Why did you get involved with the idea of lawmaking, or sometimes actually, especially in the early 20th century, more often than engaging with creating law, more with repealing laws that were discriminatory against women. And the book tells the story of how there have been turns around the idea that criminal law reform in particular is a feminist tool for social change, for protecting women, how women's movements have changed their idea, how they understand and conceive the idea of criminal law and reforming criminal law to contribute to eradicating violence against women. And we see a very important turn in the 1990s, for example, where international discourses around health, public health, around development, and also about women's rights start penetrating the region, and do land, in many cases, very effectively to promote the idea that in order to produce all these policy changes, you need to engage with law reform and with criminal law reform. And from then on, we see how the idea of women's human rights grows, the idea that law and law reform is important to secure those rights. And this has also kind of journey through political changes in the region, including a turn to the left in the early 2000s that has been known as the pink tide. And I think that that is another one of the key moments in the book, because that's where the usual explanations of so-called carceral feminism as a feminist engagement with the idea of prosecuting and punishing violence against women. This idea is very often explained in terms of co-option of feminism by right-wing sectors, and more broadly by neoliberal globalization. However, in the book, I show that many leftist feminist lawmakers and policymakers in Ecuador, and I know now in other countries as well, were promoting criminal law reform in terms of more severely punishing violence against women from a very progressive perspective, and even thinking about criminal law reform as something that could achieve economic redistribution, which is really interesting. So I think that these particularities of Latin America, of Ecuador, of the global South, maybe even, are at the center in the book, kind of nuancing the explanations that we have usually had, very often with the United States at the center, which is the case for Latin America. We're always receiving a lot of literature from North America that centers North America, obviously. And so this is a way of re-explaining things, if you will.
That came through for me so strongly in the book. I mean, I felt like I learned so much. It was, a wonderful read. And I learned so much in about anti-carceral feminism, and I think you add such an interesting and nuanced perspective to this discussion of carceral feminism. Could I ask a bit more about sort of what drew you to those arguments and to those ideas? What led you to sort of undertaking the research for this book? What was your journey towards it?
Yeah, I think the journey started quite early on in my academic career. Actually, when I was doing my master's in Ecuador, we had perspective that traversed the entire master's program around the idea of a rights-based criminal law, I would call it now, but we would then refer to it as penal guarantees, or it was a constitutional criminal law. So it was all about penal minimalism, at least in the theory, criminal law as a last resort. And at the same time, I was already starting to be involved very much with women's movements in the city. I'm from Cuenca, the south of Ecuador. And so I could perceive a kind of break between several narratives that were going on. On the one hand, what I was hearing at the master's courses about minimizing the impact of penalty. And on the other hand, there were also debates among feminists about, that was a very particular moment in Ecuadorian history. This is just before the new constitution came to force. And many feminists were afraid that the change of the constitution that would then lead to legal change as well would be a rollback of what had already been achieved by women's movement in terms of women's rights. And there was a clear awareness that a new criminal code would be created, and feminists were discussing, how do we get involved in this? Are we going to accept the idea that all of the offenses connected to violence against women should be included in an ordinary penal code, or are we going to support what had been the case until then, which is having a specialized law that is no longer in force, but was in force then, and was actually one of the biggest achievements, I suppose, of the women's movements until then, to have a specialized law that addressed violence against women. And that's when I started thinking, okay, so what do we need to do here? What if feminists thought a little bit more in terms of penal minimalism? What could happen there? And that was actually the original idea of my PhD, was to sort of bring the idea of a constitutionalized and human rights compliant criminal law to frame violence. And everything changed when I actually spoke to people, because many of these lawmakers already had that discourse. Actually, they were already saying, yes, we need criminal law actually to protect women's human rights. And it's okay because this criminal law should be minimalist, and it should be human rights compliant and respect due process. And therefore it's going to be fair. So there's no problem. And I think that's when things became really interesting and challenging at the same time. And I have to make a sort of little pause here to say that one thing that is very important for me to reflect upon is my own positionality, where I stand here. And I think that one reason why I was so critical of the carceral feminist label is because even though I had not taken any particular stand yet, and I always leaned to this penal minimalism that my professors were speaking about at the masters, I still felt like I was being accused of something because I am one of, you could easily put me within those women that I ended up interviewing later on. So I was part of that group, and I was trying to think about, what does it mean to be a carceral feminist? Is this really the case? Because that's not exactly what I'm hearing from the feminists that surround me. And this comes with a lot of privilege, because the feminists in Ecuador who have been engaging in policy making and lawmaking are usually upper middle class, mestizas, which mean that they are mixed, indigenous and white, or in any case, they are not Afro-descendants or indigenous or rural women for the most part. This has been changing progressively, but I thought it was important to say that the reason why I had a chance to think about this, engage like this empirically with the lawmakers and all of that, is because of the initial privilege of being part of the group in many ways, even though I've never been a politician or a lawmaker, but I was there in the same spaces, so to speak.
I think that sensitivity to your own positionality, it came through really strongly. I found the early discussion in your book of navigating your own identity in relation to the research really interesting. But kind of alongside that, I also felt that your interviews were really wide-ranging and really candid. It felt like your interviewees and your participants, they were really honest and reflective about the way that they negotiated processes and practices of activism and law reform. This came through really strongly and really beautifully. And it'd be great to hear more about how you approached and engaged with your participants, and sort of any other observations from your field work as well.
Yes, I think that now, in looking back at the time, I was extremely lucky. Of course, there was no pandemic, which made things a lot easier. I had funding back then. Actually, during the left-leaning government, there were international fellowships, scholarships that fully funded PhDs. That's no longer the case. Looking back, I think, wow, like I had funding for everything I did, and so that's the starting point, which is already very lucky. But also, as I was saying, I already had the trust of some of the people I interviewed, and in this kind of circles, if you have the trust of someone and that someone introduces you to another one, then they trust you as well. There is also the advantage of having been there already. People already know you because you have been there at the manifestations, you have been there at the discussions, you have been engaging with them, so you are one of them. And there's no reason to think that you're going to present them in a bad light, or that you're going to use the information in an inappropriate way, and so on. And I also managed to, I went back to Ecuador, and that's the advantage of already knowing the area, knowing how to move around it, how to navigate different cities and all of that. But I was also very lucky in that pretty much everyone I approached accepted my invitation to be interviewed. They were very generous with their time. Some people even had me over in their own houses, in their own homes, and sat with me and shared coffee and whatnot. And I'm saying this is extremely lucky because the fieldwork that I'm conducting right now has not proved that smooth. Like many people have said no or have not responded to my invitations. And actually, so looking back, it's like, wow, that worked really, really well. Even in terms of the timing I had, things worked out. But also back then, it was a very different moment, I suppose, historically in the world. It's a pre-pandemic world. The world has changed very quickly, very violently as well. And Ecuador in particular is right now a very difficult place to navigate. I feel that everybody, no one is trusting anyone anymore. It's really difficult to interview. Even for me being from there, people are quite scared. It has become extremely violent in Ecuador. There is a real issue with penetration of organized crime in the country's governance agencies and in prisons and so on. So it's just really incredible for me because it's not really that many years ago, this fieldwork was finished between 2015 and 2016. It's not that long ago. And this is a completely different world. So I have to say that I am pretty sure that for anyone right now, it would be harder to do fieldwork than it used to be before. I think also politics have become so polarized that people are really not always comfortable speaking about things. And then the other thing that I think probably made it easier for people, besides anonymization, which in some cases was necessary, in other cases, people wanted to be named. So not everybody was anonymized. Not everyone was anonymous, I mean. But besides that, it was that they knew that I was conducting my research for a foreign country, so to speak, that it was going to be written in English and most likely published outside of Ecuador. And so in a way, it probably didn't feel like they were going to be exposed. I think that was another reason for being very open. But overall, I think that the people I spoke to have that nature. So there was a willingness to be open because it was part of the work of countering violence against women. I think that there was also that ethical commitment to speaking up about what's going on. It was a part of the activism in a way, I think.
That's really interesting, both in terms of the sort of relationship between research and activism and how that relationship's changed in such a short period of time. I suppose continuing with that sort of link between then and now and between the work you're doing now, but also one of the central concepts in the book, there's this key idea of rights-based penalty. Could you talk a bit more about that concept? What this tells us about law reform, what the persistence of sort of liberal law and rights-based penalty means for us both as socio-legal scholars and as feminist legal scholars?
Yes, thank you. So this is one of the concepts that I guess emerge from the empirical work, from speaking to people, but also from looking at documents, feminist publications, but also institutional documents, and obviously the parliamentary debates, the transcriptions of how criminalizing violence against women happen, legally speaking. And at some point, it was clear to me, on the one hand, that criminalizing was an international human rights mandate. It was an obligation for the Ecuadorian state. And at that point, before the 2014 Penal Code of Ecuador came into force, the offenses of violence against women were treated as misdemeanors, which means that they were considered sort of minor offenses that were not addressed through an ordinary criminal trial, but rather a shorter, faster, simpler procedure that happened at what at the time were known as the commissariats for women and the family, sort of specialized police station. They were kind of hybrid between civil and police agencies. But in treating violence against women as misdemeanors, Ecuador was not fulfilling the commitments acquired, for example, at the level of the Inter-American human rights system, which includes the Belém do Pará Convention, which was the first international instrument to address violence against women specifically. And Article 7 of that treaty of the Belém do Pará Convention is, for the most part, about encouraging states, or even compelling, I would say, to do legal reform and focusing a lot on criminal law reform to properly punish violence against women, make sure that this is a criminal offense. So that's one thing that was part of the discourse around why do we need to make this change. But it has to be also clear that there was resistance about that, right? Not all feminists, and particularly those who were not aligned with the government, were happy with the idea of criminalizing violence against women in the sense of putting the offenses inside the penal code. Because that would mean that everything would be subject, as it is actually, to an ordinary criminal trial, which tends to be long, cumbersome, re-victimizing, difficult to navigate for women, especially those who are impoverished or racialized, discriminated against, who don't have the resources that you need to litigate. And I think that was a worry, a concern that proved right. It is really difficult to navigate the procedure, even though it's supposed to be specialized and short. However, everybody agreed that you need to recognize violence against women as an offense. The divergences were more to do with how do we procedurally deal with it. But no one said, this shouldn't be a crime. And the reason why you can't say that is that criminalizing violence against women has become so attached to the idea of protecting human rights that saying that you don't think it should be criminalized more or less is equivalent or is read as if you were saying, I don't think that this is a human rights violation. So that's where I realized, okay, so this penalty, which is taken from a Foucauldian idea, but perhaps more a feminist rendition of the idea of penalty, in the sense that penalty includes not only the criminal law, but also what we say about criminal law, includes mechanisms that we use to enforce the criminal law, including police, including some administrative agencies as well, procedures, courts, experts, forensics, and so on. All of this penal sphere, if you start digging deeper, you realize that it's now morally sustained upon the idea that it is also protecting women's human rights. And that in recognizing that women's human rights violations are criminal offenses, we are doing some important key political moral move. And some of the lawmakers I spoke to even said, we as feminists have to use this criminal law. We have to, something that used to only be considered the discourse around criminalizing violence against women, someone said, used to only be a matter of international law. Now we have to make domestic law. So it was this kind of interplay. And because there was another side of the coin, which is the idea that criminal law can be tamed, that criminal law can be human rights compliant, that you have a procedure that is going to be fair in all its phases, in all its stages, and that the sentencing is going to be just, I suppose. That is the other side of the rights-based. So you, on the one hand, protect women's rights, but you're also protecting the rights of the defendants. You're also going to be very fair to those who are aggressors, and if they're not going to be convicted. It's all this very abstract thinking, right? Like there is not really a lot of narratives regarding what really happens when someone presents a complaint about violence against women, or what happens when someone is convicted, which rarely happens. But in general, what happens to a person who is convicted of any offense in Ecuador. So that's how I saw that this penalty was being sustained, justified, presented as something progressive, actually. Something that could even be used, as I said before, to kind of do some economic redistribution, because one of the proposals back then was to create the criminal offense of patrimonial violence, of economic violence, which would tackle, when someone in a relationship that is abusive controls your resources, controls your wages, controls even your food, your access to vital resources, things like that. And so, this criminal law was really expanding to try and solve every possible problem that before had been seen maybe as a matter of more social policy. Maybe. So now it's a matter of criminal policy. So I think that's where I started seeing this is making sense, because we are always thinking in terms of rights.
Yeah, it was really clear, and that was a fascinating part of the book. The other kind of perspective that I really liked that you kind of brought to bear in the book was the way in which gender, race, and coloniality and the analysis of these is woven through the monograph. There's a really striking discussion, for example, of how the court in Ecuador treated decisions of the Indigenous Assembly. Could you explain a bit more how you use coloniality as a vector of analysis in the book?
Yes, I think that this is a concept that has different meanings. Maybe it has been expanded, reappropriated by some feminists in Latin America. But very broadly, we can say that the idea of coloniality is the idea that after the end of colonial rule, of the actual sort of conquest, if you will, after independence, there is the worldview, the colonial worldview continues to go on. And this is a historical fact, I would say, in the sense that the ruling elites in Latin America, at least after, this change of power wasn't really a change from the king to the indigenous peoples. No, it was a change from those who were Spaniards, born in Spain and whatnot, to the Criollo elites who are also white but born in the Americas for the most part. You have also some mixed people in there, but what I'm trying to say is that this is really one elite that is substituted by another, not necessarily any particular gain for the working classes, for the popular classes, for the indigenous peoples who were in many cases in conditions of servitude, and obviously not for enslaved Afro descendants. So the aspiration to whiteness, to Europeanness is still something, and it is actually part of the nation building discourse all the time. Sometimes explicitly, sometimes more disguised under the idea of civilization, of creating good citizens, the citizens of the future, of motherhood, of good child rearing, which basically, if you kind of read between the lines, it is about raising white children, or whitened or white-like children. Let's erase the indigenous, any kind of indigenous culture, indigenous ways of speaking. Civilizing is becoming white-like. So this process of nation building is obviously also revolves around law as well, around law and policy, around civil laws that have to do with property, with marriage, with land ownership, and also, I suppose, progressively more and more criminal laws to criminalize, again, behaviors that are very often connected to racial poison they used to speak about at some point in the scientific world. They believe that some racial, what could we say, like some racial vices, I suppose, could be transmitted through inheritance, through, genetically. And for example, the idea of drunkenness was connected to indigeneity, for example, very often. And so criminalizing drunkenness, which was actually a crime in the early Republican years in Ecuador and other Latin American countries, is implicitly criminalizing indigeneity, both in the discourse, but also because, it is more likely that the racialized person is going to be persecuted as opposed to the person who is white and can navigate their way around everything, around police, around violence at the home, and so on. So I think that it is very historical as well to speak about coloniality. You can see it in the laws. You can see what the law is protecting. You can see public speeches by the first presidents of the republics, of the early republics. You can see racialization in public policy documents. There were eugenics were a big deal, talking about nation building, as I said. So it's not only making people white-like, it's also trying to erase indigeneity. And this, I think, is still something. It is very difficult to speak about racism in Latin America. Most people tend, and this is because of the idea of mestizaje, which is the mixing, right? This was also crucial to nation-building discourses, to speak about there's no divide. We're not white and indigenous and Afro-descendants. Everybody has got mixed, and now there's only one mestizos. We're a nation of mestizos and mestizas. And that hides a lot of the racism, because I think that the idea of mestizo is not really, in practice, embracing all your identities. It is rather about rejecting some of them and assuming that you're pretty much white. And I'm speaking from very personal experience, but I also think that this is the experience of many, many people who struggle in that borderland between feeling indigenous, feeling white, and feeling like you struggled all your life denying certain aspects of your identity because you were told you needed to hide certain aspects of your identity, and so on. So to me, racism is one of the driving forces of politics in Latin America, one of the driving forces of economy in Latin America, and definitely one of the driving forces of lawmaking and how we frame the idea of violence and violence against women, and the idea of protecting the family, which has been the one of the main priorities, I think, of public governance that have allowed certain parts of feminist discourse to become public policy and law, as opposed to others. In Latin America, decriminalizing abortion has been a really difficult struggle. It has come very late in some places. In other places, there is still a full prohibition, such as El Salvador, for example. In Ecuador, abortion in the case of rape was very recently decriminalized after the pandemic, actually, and it was done through the Constitutional Court, not the legislature. There have been many attempts. So I see coloniality there, right? In the struggle for decriminalizing abortion that never comes, in the relative ease by which criminalizing domestic violence comes about, actually. So what are we protecting? Who are we protecting? And in practice, most importantly, who ends up being actually protected and having access to legal mechanisms, legal recourse? And in Latin America, it is not a coincidence. Those who have access to these resources are usually the people who look whiter.
I think that is a really powerful note and statement to finish on. Thank you so much, Silvana, for joining me, and congratulations again on the book and the award. It is a fantastic read, and I'd encourage everybody to go out and read it themselves, find a copy. Thank you once again, and thank you for joining us for this video.
Thank you, Kate. This was such a lovely conversation to have. I really enjoyed the questions and sharing some thoughts with you, and hopefully with many more.